I've spoken about Heinz Kohut and self-psychology previously, a few years ago, as part of the Freud and Beyond series, but I've been asked to speak a bit more comprehensively about Kohut and self-psychology, and so I will do so this evening. So Heinz Kohut was born in 1913 in Vienna and died in 1981 in the US. Um, his parents were assimilated Jews. Um, he came to America uh, in the late 1930s, I believe it was, uh, escaping from the Nazis. Um, Converted actually to Unitarianism, all forms of Christianity, Unitarianism, uh, many years later in Chicago. Um, he was originally trained in medicine and in neurology, uh, came to America. I believe he landed in New York, made his way to Chicago, managed to get a residency in neurology in Chicago. Later switched to psychiatry. Um, Applied for training at the Chicago Institute and initially was turned down, but managed to have himself accepted a few years later, um, largely through his connections with the Eislers, Kurt Eisler, um, extremely prominent classical Freudian, uh, his wife, who analyzed Kohut. Um, I'm blocking on her name at the moment. But Eisler got himself into an analysis with her in Chicago, and through the Eisler connection, um, he was able to have the negative decision reversed and he was accepted into analytic training at the Chicago Institute. The Eisler connection is interesting um, because they were associated with August Acorn, and Acorn was close to Freud, and Acorn had been um, Heinz Kohut's analyst. And that's pretty interesting because Acorn, author of a book called Wayward Youth, that Freud had personally written a foreword to, Acorn was the director of, I think, essentially a kind of institution for delinquent adolescents, wayward youth, and and he became famous for his unusual level of success in working with delinquents. And his success seems to have been due to a particular kind of technique that he employed to win their confidence. That is, he mimicked a number of the attitudes of the delinquents themselves. He presented himself as sympathetic to them, um, as kind of anti-authority and unconventional himself. In other words, he employed a technique that later came to be called mirroring. And it's very interesting that while he was Kohut's analyst, I think he had been a supervisor. Acorn had been a supervisor, or at least someone that Hyman Spotnitz greatly admired, and I'm not sure whether Spotnitz was also analyzed by Acorn. I'm not sure, but there was a connection between Spotnitz and Acorn, and like Kohut, Spotnitz made a technique of mirroring central to his brand of psychoanalysis, which came to be called modern psychoanalysis. And the modern analysts uh, had institutes in New York and Philadelphia, Boston, New Jersey, and they had their own journal called Modern Psychoanalysis. So there are parallels, really, between Kohut and Spotnitz through the connection with Acorn, and the Eislers also were connected to Acorn, and through the Eisler connection, Kohut managed to get into the Chicago Institute, trained as a psychoanalyst, and went on to have a very distinguished psychoanalytic career in the Chicago Institute, in the American Psychoanalytic Association, and even on the level of the International Psychoanalytic Association. For many years, he taught the central metapsychology theory course at the Chicago Institute, and he taught it in a very classically Freudian way. He was known as Mr. Psychoanalysis in Chicago. So, like the Eislers, Kohut represented a very classically Freudian perspective until the time that he retired as president of the American Psychoanalytic Association. This would be around 1960. Uh, and at that point, he began to develop some of his own creative thoughts, departing from Freudian orthodoxy increasingly, uh, and founding that rather separate school of thought in some ways, called psychoanalytic self-psychology, or the psychology of the self. Um, Initially, he tried to develop his new ideas um, in the context of mainstream psychoanalytic thinking as a bit of an adjunct, um, as something of an expansion of Freudian ideas about narcissism. So his first book, The Analysis of the Self, really is an attempt to expand Freud's thinking in the area of narcissism in new and creative ways. But certainly by the time, I think 1971 was the year of publication of the analysis of the self. But by 1978, when Kohut published The Restoration of the Self, he'd pretty much broken off relations with headquarters. I always use that, the metaphor drawn from Apocalypse Now, Conrad's novel, and the film based on it. Kurtz takes his army, breaks off relations with headquarters, and goes into Cambodia. Kohut kind of breaks off relations with headquarters by 1978. He's now presenting self-psychology not as an expansion of Freudian, classical Freudian thought, but rather as an alternative to it in substantial ways. Okay, one of his, he wrote an interesting early article published in I think in around 1955 or 56, a paper on music. I think several other early papers. I think it was in 1959 that he published the very important paper titled Introspection, Empathy, and the Method of Psychoanalysis, something in the field of psychoanalysis. And it's in that paper that he defines uh, empathy as the central methodology of psychoanalysis, and argues that this is the essence really of psychology as such, the act in which we imaginatively place ourselves in the viewpoint or the perspective or the shoes of the other. Um, this separates psychology from the study of the material world. We cannot empathically enter into um, the world of material things, but we can empathically enter into the subjective world of human subjects. Um, I can't recall whether in that article Kohut explicitly refers to Wilhelm Delphi, um, the philosopher who distinguished really many decades earlier, who distinguished between the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften, the natural sciences and the human sciences, precisely on this basis, that in the natural sciences we must necessarily adopt an external point of view suitable for the study of objects. An objective method is suitable for the study of objects. But when we turn to psychology and the other social sciences, we have now turned to the study of beings who are not merely objects, but who also are subjects. And therefore, we have this additional method of entering into their subjectivity imaginatively through the act of empathy. Anyway, I think he clearly was influenced by Delphi, and this is a central theme in his work, empathy. And one could see self-psychology really, in many ways, as an expansion, a central focusing on, and an expansion of the significance of the empathic method. Maybe I should say a word about empathy. Kohut himself, I don't think, makes too much of an explicit distinction between empathy and sympathy, but I do. Kohut, I don't think, confined empathy to the merely cognitive act of imagining the mind of the other. I've always made the point that psychopaths are highly empathic. They have to be, because if the psychopath is going to get you to open your wallet or purse or whatever and give him the contents thereof, he has to be able to put himself into your perspective and imagine what kind of words and maneuvers he needs to express in order to get you to do that. Um, and some psychopaths are very skilled at empathy. I also make the point that for the sadist to be able to enjoy inflicting pain and humiliation on his victim, he has to be highly empathic. What would be the point of inflicting pain and humiliation if he wasn't able to empathically recognize what you're feeling and enjoy the pain he's inflicting and the humiliation that he's inflicting? So sadists and psychopaths have to be highly empathic. Now, Kohut would never say this because Kohut was not restricting empathy to this act of cognition, which can be a cold act of cognition. Um, the psychopath may say, I know exactly how you're feeling, I just don't give a damn. I understand that you're in pain, but I don't care. Okay, that's empathy. To take the second step and say, I know how you feel and I care, and I wish to relieve your pain, we have now moved from empathy into sympathy. That's not Kohut. Kohut is not employing these terms in this way. And in fact, rather to the contrary, for Kohut, empathy, rather than being a merely cognitive apprehension of what the other is feeling, Kohut doesn't exactly say that empathy is curative in and of itself. It would be false to say that. I think for some of his followers, I think probably many in the field of self-psychology probably would say that. I think they believe that empathy is almost curative in itself, but not for Kohut. For Kohut, it remained a technique. Unlike many of his followers, Kohut insisted on the importance of insight. Insight into different phenomena than those emphasized by classical Freudian analysts. Classic Freudian analysts are emphasizing insight into the ways I am driven by my sexual and aggressive drives, insight into the way I experience internal conflict between my sexual and aggressive drives and my ego's rational function and my superego's moralistic attacks and directives, insight into my internal conflicts. That's the Freudian emphasis. For Kohut, insight remains important, but rather than insight into internal conflict, it's insight into my problems of self-esteem, insight into the states of inner fragmentation and inner emptiness from which I suffer, insight into how, in the face of empathic failures from significant others, I disintegrate, I fragment, I fall apart. Insight into what I then do in the face of this falling apart, what I then do in the face of this fragmentation to try to pull myself together again, like turn to substances or turn to driven sexuality. One of Kohut's concepts that I think was insufficiently attended to is his concept of the disintegration product. And it reflects a very different view of various forms of acting out than the view held by the Freudians. Someone who is acting out destructively or acting out sexually in destructive ways, the classical Freudian might see that acting out as a failure of defenses against drives. A regression, a breakdown of self-control, perhaps a kind of ego weakness or a failure on the part of the superego. The result being that the id drives have taken over and I'm acting out sexually or acting out aggressively. Kohut, in his concept of the disintegration product, sees this kind of acting out quite differently. For Kohut, something has caused a fragmentation of the self. There's been an insult. There's been a narcissistic injury. Something has happened. I've suffered a narcissistic wound. I've had my feelings hurt. I have felt rejected or slighted. And in the face of this, I have suffered a collapse of self-esteem. I have suffered a fragmentation of my sense of self. And this is unbearable. This is extremely painful. And in the face of this fragmentation, I turn to sexuality, or I turn to aggression, or I turn to a substance uh, in order to not merely soothe the pain of the injured sense of self, but somehow to try to pull myself together again through sexual drivenness or angry drivenness or a substance. This is the disintegration product. So we have a critique of drive theory here. And here's the fundamental difference between the Freudian view of human nature and Kohut's view of human nature. For Freud, we are a creature half human and half animal. In Erik Erikson's terms, the Freudian vision is a centaur model of man, head and torso of a man and the body of a horse. The superego and the ego on the level of the human, and the id, the level of the animal. So here we are, driven by id drives, grounded in a somatic source, says Freud, driven by these animalistic urges. I mean, I'm not saying that Freud saw these as animal instincts. No, he knew that the drives, the triba, were uniquely human and unlike animal instincts in that their aims and objects are open to learning and displacement and reversal. But nevertheless, they are, for Freud, grounded in the soma, in the animal part of the human being. And these somatically based drives of sex and aggression need to be tamed, uh, redirected, rendered adaptive, socialized, sublimated. But we're saddled with these drives. And sometimes the defenses and the sublimations break down and the id drives get acted out. Um, okay, for Kohut, we are not uh, creatures who are driven by ultimately somatically grounded drives. Uh, Kohut is part of what has been called the relational turn in psychoanalytic thinking. Um, there's a wonderful essay by the late Stephen Mitchell, I think in his book, Relational Concepts in Psychoanalysis. I think it's the first or second chapter of the book. I think it's called or maybe the book is called The Relational Matrix. Yeah, the relational matrix, and the chapter is called The Relational Turn in Psychoanalysis. Um, we're talking about the turn away from this Freudian vision of the centaur driven by somatically rooted drives to a much more relational, a much more social understanding of the human being as oriented far more towards the other. Not so much drive driven, but um, oriented to needs for social responsiveness from others. And so other elements of this relational turn would be the work of the so-called culturistic school of Sullivan and Horney. Erich Fromm is often associated with that school, but he's quite unique in that he is an existentialist, but he certainly is part of the relational turn. Stephen Mitchell and his colleagues, um, a whole series. But certainly Heinz Kohut is part of this. Uh, the work of the so-called intersubjectivists, Stollerow, Atwood, Brandschaft, they started out as self-psychologists, and then they claim to have moved a bit beyond self-psychology into what they call intersubjectivity theory. But all of these post-Freudian schools of thought, including self-psychology, reflect this relational turn. Um, for Kohut, this is the idea of the human being as beginning rather in a state of fragmentation. And here's a link to Lacan. Jacques Lacan also sees the infant as born into a state of originary fragmentation, le corps morcelé, the body in bits and pieces, fragmentation. And only gradually does the infant come out of this original state of fragmentation um, by putting together a sense of self. Lacan calls this the ego, which is not Freud's ego. What he means really is the image in the mirror, a self-image. There is a connection here between Lacan and self-psychology, from fragmentation to the generation of a sense of self. For Lacan, this sense of self that he calls ego, which is the specular image, the image in the mirror, is essentially a false self. That's a Winnicottian concept. Um, it's rather an illusion. The child mistakes himself for the image in the mirror. And there's the mirroring connection again between uh, Lacan and Kohut. Uh, for Kohut, uh, that sense of the falseness of the self is absent. I'm not saying that he denies the existence of a false self, but he doesn't make he's not talking about how we fall into alienation, that the first self is inevitably a false self. That's Lacan. That's not Kohut. Kohut is saying that we experience this fragmentation, and we are trying to put together a cohesive self. We are not born with a cohesive self. Uh, he suggests that we're born with certain of the raw potentials to develop a cohesive self. He implies it is our task to realize. There is a sense of self-realization in Kohut. We're born with these potentials, but we're fragmented. But we have the potential to put together a cohesive self. But in order to do this, we require what he calls self-object function from others, significant others who provide this needed self-object function through which we can gradually put together a self. Okay, when he first advanced the concept of the self-object, he spelt it self-object, and he later revised that, eliminated the hyphen, and gave the term a different meaning. What did the term mean in the first place? It meant a self incompletely differentiated from the object. So a self-object is an object from whom I am incompletely differentiated, from whom I have incompletely differentiated myself. So there's a sense of fusion or merger between the self and the self-object. Kohut dropped that definition. He switched to spelling it without the hyphen, and he changed its meaning from an object incompletely differentiated from the self to an object that performs needed functions for the self, not fused with the self, not merged with the self, but performing needed functions for the self. Why did he make this change? Because he was prescient, he saw where the infant research was going. And the infant research was actually validating Melanie Klein against Sigmund Freud. Freud postulated that at the beginning of life, for some months, the infant is in a state continuous with prenatal life, a state of what he called primary narcissism, uh, a state of fusion or oneness, no I, not I distinction, no self-other distinction. Um, Experience in primary narcissism, Freud said, is oceanic experience, unboundaried oneness. In chapter 1 of Civilization and Its Discontents, he traces mystical experience back to this earliest state. In other words, he calls mystical experience a regression, a massive regression, although he suggests that the mystic may hang on to reality in other sectors of the ego. But in one sector, the mystic takes the elevator all the way down to the bottom, back to the most primitive mental state before differentiation. Um, uh, okay. And of course, that's how the Freudians understood psychosis, as a breakdown of differentiation and a falling back into this primordial primitive oneness. And this is how they understood psychotic states, which is why they sat their patients up, made them sit in a chair, and started doing a kind of reality-oriented work with them. If the patient seemed to be falling into psychosis, this was seen as a regression, a loss of differentiation, a loss of boundaries, back into these primitive fusional oceanic states. Now, Melanie Klein had said there is no primary narcissism. And the Kleinians understood psychosis quite differently, not as a loss of differentiation, well, not as a regression to primary narcissism, because there is no primary narcissism, says Klein. The confusion is due to projective identification for the Kleinians. I'm putting so much of me into you in my fantasy, and in my fantasy, I'm taking so much of you and putting that into me that I'm now mixed up about what's you and what's me. But this is something I'm doing. This is not regression to a primordial state, which doesn't exist. Okay, Kohut saw that the infant research was validating Klein. Primary narcissism does not exist. The infant research with the cameras on the mother and the baby watching their dance is confirming Klein's view that there is a primitive ego having relations with a primitively conceived object or part objects from the beginning. Kohut sees this, and so he stops defining the self-object as an object incompletely differentiated from the self, and starts in speaking instead about self-object function being provided to the self by needed others. And what are these self-object functions that self-objects provide to the self? Uh, these are initially mirroring and idealizing. Okay, he thought of the mother as the mirroring self-object. The baby is mirrored in the mother's eyes and in the mother's mind and expectations, and we are we see ourselves in the mirror of significant others. We see ourselves in the mirror held up to us by society, and this is one of the ways we acquire a sense of self, through mirroring. Um, if, by the way, Winnicott also wrote a paper about the mirroring role of the mother's eyes, the infant seeing himself in the mother's eyes. There's a connection there between Winnicott and Kohut. And of course, there are many connections between Winnicott and Kohut. In fact, there are whole sentences in Kohut's that look like they almost come out of Winnicott's writings. I'm not accusing him of plagiarism, but there are very large parallels between elements of Winnicott's thought and Kohut's thought. Okay, so the child's first opportunity to put together a sense of self is through the mother's mirroring. Um, Look, Ma, no hands. Um, and she looks at him with pride and admiration. He's made a very nice poop in the right place, and she's proud of his achievement. And through a million acts of mirroring of this sort, the baby puts together, hopefully, a positively mirrored sense of self. Um, Obviously, negative mirroring has the opposite consequences. Um, the child in a family, a nuclear family where there's also a father, has a second chance if things did not go well with mother, uh, and the self is remaining fragmented. The child can begin to try to put together a cohesive self through idealizing the father's strength and calmness, and attempting to merge in with and identify with and internalize um, these calming, strengthening qualities of the father. So these are the two main types of self-object function. And of course, the analyst becomes a self-object or begins to perform self-object functions for the patient who comes to analysis with a disordered self. Um, Kohut thinks that the term narcissistic disorders has a moralistic ring to it, given the Judeo-Christian um, disapproval of selfishness, narcissism. So he redefines the narcissistic disorders as the disorders of the self. And there's a valid point to be made there, because the earlier classical Freudians tended to disapprove of narcissistic patients rather moralistically. Like, grow up already. All the rest of us have had to face the fact that our shit stinks too. And what's with you? How come you haven't come to this recognition? Grow up already. Kind of the background attitude of classical analysts who saw narcissism not so much as a pathology, um, as a kind of immaturity, a kind of failure to grow up. And there was this implicit moralistic idea that, you need to grow up. Well, sometimes narcissistic disorders were seen as simply unanalyzable. Freud himself said it's only the transference neuroses that are analyzable. The narcissistic neuroses are unanalyzable. Why? Because they don't form a transference. Um, Kohut performed a huge function in saying, but yes, they do form a transference, but it's a different kind of transference than the transferences produced by neurotics, which are object instinctual transferences. That is, they see the analyst as the loved or hated father, the loved or hated mother. The patient gets emotionally involved with the analyst, transferring onto the analyst the images of the parents and the feelings and the siblings. These are the transference neuroses, and analysis proceeds by the analysis of these transferences. But these narcissistic patients, who started showing up increasingly after about 1950, these patients don't produce object instinctual transferences. They go on and on and on forever about themselves and their hurt feelings and their fragmentation and their emptiness. Uh, and the classical Freudian feels there's nothing to analyze here. The patient is supposed to be developing feelings about me, and I'm supposed to be helping him understand that this is really rooted in mother, father. But these patients aren't doing this. No transference, no analysis. Kohut says, but wait a minute. These patients are producing transferences, but they're a different category of transference called the self-object transferences. They come to the analyst seeking mirroring because the early mirroring didn't work. sufficiently to produce a cohesive self. So they're attempting to resume the development of their self with the analyst. And so they're displaying themselves in front of the analyst as if the analyst is a mirror. Now, the analyst is having trouble staying awake. He's used to um, being enlivened by patience, love, and hate directed at him. And now that's not happening. And he's being treated like a mirror. He's simply supposed to sit there and admire or applaud the narcissistic displays put on by the patient who is seeking his admiration uh, and approval. Um, but that's a transference. That's a mirror transference. And sometimes the patient arrives and falls into a deep idealization of the analyst, puts him on a pedestal, begins to relate to him as a kind of a god. Um, and this makes the classical analyst quite uncomfortable. He spent years in his own analysis trying to come to terms with the dismal fact that he's not God. And now he's got a patient who's telling him he's God or relating to him as a God. Classical analyst was inclined to want to disillusion him, throw ice water on him, wake up. Uh, but the implication of Kohut's thinking is patient's trying to achieve something through idealization that failed with his father. Um, he's trying to resume a development that was thwarted either because father wasn't there or because he became traumatically disillusioned with his father because of some major paternal failure. And he's trying to resume development with the analyst through this idealization. Kohut later went on to talk about a third type of self-object transference, the alter ego or the twinship transference. It's like the two of us are a team. We're very alike. Uh, we have a bond. Um, and through this twinning, the patient is strengthening his sense of self. Twinship or alter ego transference. Some self-psychologists, I'm not sure whether it was Kohut himself or colleagues, but they began to speak about a fourth type of self-object transference, the adversarial self-object transference. Here there is competition. There's an adversarial relationship between the analyst and the patient. We have disagreements. You're all for this, I'm all for that. And we're very different, but through our disagreement, through our adversarial struggle, I get a differentiated sense of self. I see myself as not you in significant ways, and that strengthens my sense of self, the adversarial. And then some of Kohut's colleagues finally began to speak of a fifth type of self-object function, the abstract self-object. We know that some people in the death camps survived because they were religious, and no matter how humiliated and degraded they were by the environment around them, they believed that God loved them despite their humiliation and helplessness. And through the idea that they were loved by God, they managed to sustain a sense of self. And they were less likely to throw themselves on the electric fences. That's the abstract self-object, God. I've often thought that some artists were able to sustain themselves through the abstract self-object constituted by by the future. Uh, I, I, I take my art around to the galleries and they laugh and they devalue my work, but I'm just ahead of my time. Uh, uh, Long after I'm gone, they will finally realize that I was a genius. Um, so if one can believe and sustain oneself by this idea that one will be belatedly recognized in the future, one can sustain a sense of self and keep on working. Okay, these are the different forms of self-object function, and patients who have disorders of the self, they come into analysis, they tend not to produce the object instinctual transferences that the Freudians are looking for. Instead, they produce this other kind of transference, and these transferences are analyzable. And the analysis of the self takes place very much through what Kohut called the disruption repair cycle. The analyst is trying to maintain empathic contact and provide self-object function, but he fails. There will be inevitable empathic failures. And when these occur, the patient fragments. Um, if on Friday I am not in adequate empathic contact with my patient, um, my empathic failure disrupts the patient. He may have not resorted to cocaine or sexual acting out for months. But over the weekend, he regresses and falls back into that old behavior in the face of the fragmentation of his self due to my empathic failure on Friday's session. And I hear about this on Monday, and we trace the regression to what happened in Friday's session, and the patient acquires insight into the empathic failure that took place, insight into how that led to a fragmentation, insight into what the patient then did to try to escape the painful fragmentation, insight into the acting out. And through talking together about what happened and the consequences, the relationship, the self-object connection is reestablished or repaired. This is the disruption repair cycle. And after a million of these disruptions and repairs over the period of the time of the analysis, the patient's fragmentation-prone self comes to be healed. So Kohut continues to emphasize insight in this way. In this way, Kohut does not reduce the cure to the relationship. It's not merely a relational cure. It remains, of course, the relationship is crucial to the cure. And so Kohut is part of the relational churn. Mind you, I think the Freudians also saw the relationship, and certainly the Kleinians saw the relationship, the fact of transference and the analysis of transference. Of course, but the emphasis for Freudians and Kleinians was heavily on insight, although even there, internalization, in addition to insight, certainly for the Kleinians, internalization and the building up of a good internal object. Kohut's equivalent of that is what he calls transmuting internalization. Over the course of the analysis, the patient comes to internalize the empathic function, the self-object function provided by the analyst. This is internalized. The patient comes to be better able to provide empathic function to herself. That's transmuting internalization. Bears a resemblance to Klein's idea of the building up of a good internal object through internalization. Uh, but my point is that, like the Freudians and Kleinians, Kohut continues to see an important role, um, uh, the important role of insight into fragmentation, insight into the origins of the fragmentation, insight into how early empathic failures left me with a fragmentation-prone self, insight into why I seek so much mirroring, why I am such a mirror-hungry personality, insight into why I am so excessively looking for applause and recognition, and why no amount of applause really sustains me for very long, how I'm addicted to uh, validation, recognition, appreciation, and applause, and how I fall apart in the face of its absence. Insight into why it is that I idealize and worship people like gods. Um, Insight how I resort to these techniques to pull myself together in the face of my fragmentation-prone self. Okay, this is Kohut's understanding of the cure. Um, Kohut continued to think that a certain amount of frustration is necessary for psychological growth or development. He spoke of optimal frustration, the element of frustration that's built into the analysis. The session ends after 50 minutes. The sessions stop over the weekend. The analyst goes on holiday. The analyst charges a fee. All of this is frustrating. And for Kohutians like Freudians, this frustration performs a necessary element in the developmental process. Children grow through a certain amount of frustration that has to be overcome for them to move forward. Um, some of Kohut's followers stopped speaking about optimal frustration, and they started talking instead about what they call optimal responsiveness. And this is a huge turning in self-psychology. Kohut did not make that turn. He did not see optimal responsiveness as the essential element in the cure. He continued to see the need for frustration, but the optimal responsiveness people really started moving away from insight to a significant degree and started seeing the curative element, the analyst's capacity to optimally respond to the patient's needs. And now we have a kind of therapy that is emerging, which in my view makes the analyst far too important, um, into a rather sort of salvific figure who is going to somehow heal the patient by giving them a level of responsiveness um, that is going to be curative, not so much the insight that the patient derives, but into the input that the analyst provides. This is a model of therapy as provision. Uh, the patient is seen as suffering from deficits left by inadequate parental responsiveness. The analyst, unlike the bad, inadequate parents, is going to provide the right kind of responsiveness. The analyst is going to be empathic and warm and caring and is going to provide the responsiveness that is needed for the cure. This is a dangerous development. Um, this puts way too much responsibility into the analyst rather than the patient. It's not that the patient must learn about how he or she operates, how he or she fragments, how he or she then turns to destructive ways of trying to restore the sense of self. No, it's not the patient learning as an agent how to deal with injuries to self-esteem in a more creative or adaptive way. No, it's about the patient bringing their gaps and their deficits and their deprivations to the analyst who responds in healing ways. That's not psychoanalysis anymore. That's reparenting. Um, that's a cure through love rather than a cure through self-understanding and enhanced self-control. I've got nothing against love. In a broad sense, the analyst should be loving in the sense of agape. The analyst should be well-meaning. The analyst should be caring. But the analyst is not God. And the analyst is not a parent. And the analyst helps by helping the patient to help herself. Okay, so we have to distinguish between classical self-psychology, Kohut's own understanding, as opposed to people who took self-psychology in this other direction, which is very relational. It's a cure through relatedness. Of course, there has to be relatedness between analyst and patient, but does the relatedness facilitate self-understanding and self-control? Or is the relatedness somehow supposed to be the whole essential main ingredient in the cure? This is a point of division um, in the field. Okay. I find self-psychology very useful. My main model tends to be a Kleinian Freudian model, but Kohut is sitting right up here on my shoulder. And when things aren't going well between me and my patient, I become a self-psychologist for a time. I do what Kohut and his followers recommend. I try to decenter from my own perspective on the case. I try to look at what's going on as much as I possibly can through the patient's eyes. I suspend my own theories as much as possible. Something seems not to be working properly. What am I missing? What is the patient trying to tell me about what I'm missing? I try to immerse myself in the patient's point of view. That's the practice of empathy. Uh, so I'm scrutinizing myself from a self-psychological point of view, and often I find this leads to important insight into something that has been overlooked, or a mistake that I've been making, or something that I've been blind to. Sometimes it opens my eyes to dimensions of the case that I've been a bit oblivious to. And so in this sense, I find it very valuable. Kohut, unfortunately, though, like Herbert Marcuse, had what I see as the mistaken idea that around 1950, there emerged a whole new kind of patient. Erik Erikson saw this and described it, and he said, before 1950, patients came feeling that they knew who they were and who they were supposed to be, but they just couldn't be it. After 1950, patients came not knowing who they were or even who they should be. And this is, I think, a valid description of a shift that took place. Kohut called this the disappearance of guilty man and his replacement by what he called tragic man. And of course, Herbert Marcuse, in his essay, The Obsolescence of the Freudian Model of Man, argues that the Freudian model of man is obsolescent not because it was wrong, it was right for a time that has now passed. The Freudian model of man fits what Kohut calls guilty man, man prior to 1950, who knows who he is and ought to be, but can't be it, and is guilty because he can't be what he knows he ought to be. That kind of patient has, Kohut argued, disappeared. Of course, that's incorrect in and of itself. Guilty man never disappeared. We still see guilty man. We still see neurotic patients. Not every patient is a narcissist. Not every patient has a disorder of the self. There are plenty of neurotics around. So that was a mistake to say that guilty man disappeared. But certainly this new kind of patient certainly rose to prominence. I think Christopher Lasch in The Culture of Narcissism explains some of the socioeconomic roots of this, the shift from industrial capitalism to consumer capitalism. It's not about producing and saving. It's about spending and enjoying. The society encourages and breeds narcissism, and the result are these narcissistic conditions. So such a shift did occur to some degree, not completely. This describes, I think, a reality, this shift. But where it really goes wrong is that, in my opinion, it fails to understand that under the surface of tragic man, guilty man is still alive and well. The fragmentation experienced by the disordered self is fragmentation that I think is brought about by a savage superego. But in self-psychology, there really is no superego. The superego has fragmented the self. People who have disordered selves in significant ways are being persecuted, by a savage superego. And in the analysis of a disordered self, this comes to the surface. This gradually becomes evident. If the patient is going to arrive at anything like a cure, we have to get down to the guilty man buried beneath tragic man. So self-attack is going on. The fragmentation, the emptiness, is the result of self-attack. And there are reasons why the person is attacking himself or herself. There are reasons why she cannot defend herself adequately against the fragmenting attack of this primitive superego. This needs to be analyzed. So in a certain sense, what I'm saying is that when I'm approached by someone with a self disorder, I will do self-psychology with them for some weeks or months, maybe longer. In the earlier phases of the analysis, I'm trying to establish empathic contact. I'm recognizing the self-object transferences that are being formed. But as the analysis deepens, I gradually emerge as a Kleinian and as a Freudian. And we begin to talk about the inner attacker, the harsh inner judge who is accusing me of being worthless and bad, the ways I sabotage myself, and so on. It turns into a Kleinian Freudian analysis But in order to get there with certain patients, one has to do self-psychology for a considerable period of time. Um, so in that sense, I think the self-psychology development has been useful, necessary, valuable, but also misleading because um, many of the self-psychologists never got to the point where they recognized the old sadomasochistic superego dynamics underneath the self-disorder, which is on the top. Underneath, we need to analyze um, the psychodynamics. Okay.